what I'd say about Al Jazeera is that they were trying to compete with Russia Today, BBC, etc., on providing a relatively unbiased... Obviously, they're funded by the government of Qatar. They're not going to be too critical of their own government. But nevertheless, for example, they were the only media channel in the Middle East that regularly had on Israeli spokespeople justifying Israel's position on various things.
And supporting Palestinians, for example. But, I mean,
they brought the Israelis on to give their position. In Saudi Arabia, which is an ally of Israel, Israelis aren't allowed to come on TV in Saudi Arabia to justify their position. Nobody justifies their position. Saudi TV is just controlled completely by the government. There was also, amazingly,
putting all of the British media to shame, that, as they did back in January, Al Jazeera, by doing a sting operation against the Israeli embassy and the political attaché Shai Massot, who, amongst one of the things that he said quietly while he was being secretly recorded, was that there is £1 million slush fund in order to influence the Labour Party, in order to get pro-Zionist people higher up in the Labour Party, and to take out people who are pro-Palestinian in the Labour Party.
Well, including people they were also talking in that secretly filmed conversation about getting rid of a Tory government minister they didn't like. Now, of course, we keep going. There's a load of confected nonsense going on about did the Russians hack the French election or whatever. Meanwhile, we've got overwhelming evidence that the Israelis are spending money hand over fist, and of course, it's US taxpayer money if you think about it, because they haven't got any money of their own. It's a client state in order to try and influence British politics.
Also, we're hearing today that the Senate has voted for new sanctions on Iran and Russia. Germany and Austria criticising the new US sanctions against Russia. Putin, Russia, wants constructive dialogue with the United States, but they're not getting it, are they?
No, and of course the Austrians and the Germans they're basically partners on building a gas pipeline, the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, which will come under the Baltic Sea from Siberia and deliver gas directly to Germany. It's an absolutely logical economic thing to do, makes perfect sense, but of course the Americans are very unhappy, because that means that they basically will be, eventually the economic ties will squeeze them out.
Anyway, it's 50 years since the Six-Day War, which was based on a lie. Great article, actually, on the Intercept website about that. I'll put a link up to that on our show page, exactly why the Six-Day War was based on a lie. That Israel was being attacked and illegally trebled the size of the Israeli state back in 1967. And it's 100 years since the original secret Balfour Declaration, which promised Zionists a homeland in the British Empire. Yes, hardly any analysis of what's become an open wound in the Middle East, with religious fundamentalism, Zionist, many argue, rather than Muslim, at the heart of it. Tonight we hear about abuses of the Old Testament Bible, Moses' Exodus 3,500 years ago, by Zionist fundamentalists to justify apartheid and land grabs. We're going to hear now from the author of Christian Zionism, Roadmap to Armageddon. He's a former Church of England vicar, just retired, and his name is Stephen Sizer.
Well, my name is Stephen Sizer. I'm a retired minister of the Church of England, and I've been involved with Christian, Jewish and Muslim groups in the Middle East for about 20 years. I took out pilgrimage groups for a number of years, and it was through engaging with Jewish groups as well as Palestinian groups, I realized that the main line or mainstream script which we see and hear in our newspapers and on the TV screens is largely driven by an American or Israeli agenda, and that tends to polarize people's views into the good guys and the bad guys. Arabs typically are bad, Muslims are bad, and Israel can do no wrong. And then when you add the religious dimension, particularly Christians believe that somehow what's happening in Israel, Palestine today is God's will and fulfillment of Bible prophecy. When you add all those things together, it's a really volatile cocktail. And I did some study on it. I read a couple of books. I got into trouble with the Israel lobby. But I've continued to go back and try and understand and try and be a bridge builder or an advocate for Palestinian groups, particularly who feel marginalized and ignored, and be a voice for them in the West and in Britain in particular.
Now, those books, I know there's one called Christian Zionism, another one called the Roadmap to Armageddon, which is quite a provocative title. Am I right in thinking that the publishers, that they're not available through the publishers anymore?
Well, there were two books. Christian Zionism, Roadmap to Armageddon was my PhD thesis, which came out in 2004. That quite a heavy book, 400 pages. The publishers didn't expect it to sell more than a few hundred copies. It actually sold several thousand. Got published in the States in Arabic, Farsi, and parts of it in Chinese and Korean, but it needs updating. It was my PhD thesis over 10 years, published in 2004, so I was working on it for the 10 years prior to that. So it's rather out of date, so I'm not surprised that they felt it needed to be revised before they reprint it or publish it. Second book, Zion's Christian Soldiers, is more timeless, shorter, punchier, looking at how the Bible has been used and abused by various groups to justify what's happening in the Middle East. And I published that, I think, around 2008. So again, it's nearly 10 years old and it needs updating.
Christian Zionism, actually, we don't hear very much about it at all on the mainstream press. What is it?
Well, Zionism is a word that describes a particular political philosophy that came about in about the 1870s, 1880s. The word was coined as a movement aspiring to create a state for the Jews in the Middle East. You know, at the time when Jews were suffering in Eastern Europe, they were marginalized, persecuted. There was a lot of anti-Semitism.
Was the focus of the Zionists right from the start on Jerusalem?
No. If I can go back and answer your question about Christian Zionism, Zionism was a political theory or a conviction that the Jews wanted to have their own independent state. And clearly Jerusalem was central to that, but the land itself, they went back to the time of Abraham and the promise God made to Abraham, your land, or, you know, from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates. And that at the time was part of the Ottoman Empire. And as the empire declined and Britain and France took over, the Zionist movement saw Britain as a potential ally in realizing their vision, their dream. So Christian Zionism came about, again, about the 1870s, 1880s as a religious movement born out of the conviction that God wanted the Jews to be back in the land as a Christian nation. Well, as the Jews came back to the land, they didn't come back as Christians, and it certainly wasn't a Christian nation. And so progressively Christian Zionism modified itself to the view that the Jews must be encouraged to come back to the land and then they will come to the Messiah later. So today probably 9 out of every 10 Zionists are Christians, particularly in the States, 60, 70 million at least. People who identify themselves as pro-Zionist out of their Christian convictions. Jerusalem is central to Zionism, clearly, because at the moment it's still a divided city. There are no embassies in Jerusalem. They're all in Tel Aviv because the international community recognizes Tel Aviv as the capital of Israel. Israel wants to have Jerusalem as its capital because it will consolidate its claim to the West Bank as well as that part of the land which is regarded as the state of Israel today.
So, June in 2017, it is exactly 50 years since the Six-Day War, which was fought while people were bopping in Britain to the Beatles and things like that. We weren't necessarily concentrating on the Middle East, but it was to have pretty enormous consequences for the years to come, wasn't it?
Very definitely. From an Israeli point of view, they saw themselves as a beleaguered state surrounded by Arab states that denied their right to exist. From an Israeli point of view, they were attacked and they fought back, and in their victory took land which had previously been part of Egypt and Gaza, part of Jordan in the West Bank, and parts of Syria, which was the Golan. From the Arab point of view, they would regard Israel as having preemptively struck. I mean, they destroyed the Egyptian Air Force on the ground, for example. They saw Israel as the aggressor because they were taking land that was not theirs, and the West Bank in particular had always been part of the aspiration for the Jewish state. I mean, under international law, where there is progressively a war between nations, at the end of that war, irrespective of who was the belligerent, land has to be returned to the sovereign state to which it belonged before the war. So under international law, Israel's annexation of East Jerusalem, its occupation of Gaza, the Golan Heights, and the West Bank is entirely illegal under international law.
But the Israelis will say, won't they, that there's a higher law here, and that's God's law.
Well, when we start to
bandy about the Bible to justify one side, inevitably we're very selective in our use of Scripture. There is plenty in the Old Testament prophets that emphasize the importance of sharing the land when they returned out of exile with the people living in the land. So I would say, as a theologian, there is much more grounds theologically and biblically for a shared one-state solution than a two-state. And certainly it's untenable to claim promises from, say, God's promises made to Abraham and apply them today and ignore the ethical requirements which the prophets laid down upon God's people when they returned to the land, about who they shared it with and how they regarded it as God's land.
I mean, the Israelis now would say, well, we are sharing the land.
Well, they're not, because the land, if we're talking about the occupied territories, they have settled it with several 100,000 Israeli Jews, and they've denied fundamental basic rights of the Palestinians who live there. They don't have the right to vote. They don't have the right to represent themselves. It is an ongoing occupation which has been condemned repeatedly by the United Nations. And Europe, the UK, Russia, the US, EU have all subscribed to a two-state solution where Israel must withdraw from the West Bank and allow a sovereign, independent Palestinian state, two states side by side. That's what the international community regards as a just resolution of going back 100 years to the Balfour Declaration, 1917, and the War of 1967.
What do you think the significance is of the Six-Day War today?
Well, it was 50 years, which means it's the longest-running conflict that's still continuing, the longest-running dispute in the hands of the United Nations. I mean, Israel-Palestine is the subject of more UN resolutions than any other issue. So its significance is that it's an open wound, and one whereby Israelis and Palestinians are suffering, and it has repercussions both for Syria in the Golan Heights, for the Lebanon, for Egypt, for Jordan. They're all suffering as a consequence of a failure to resolve the conflict.
What about the US role in all of this? Because the US were the first to recognise the State of Israel, and also we've got a new President Trump.
Israel was recognized by the President of the United States against the advice of his ambassadors in the Middle East, and certainly against the advice of the UN. But the Zionist lobby got to him, and, the State of Israel was recognized and came into existence through a UN resolution, which is very unusual. The rest of the world caved in because the US was the superpower. In international law, Israel is recognized as a sovereign state, but within the pre-1967 borders. But the US continues to play a very partisan role in the conflict. Various presidents have made noises about the settlements, for example, or sharing Jerusalem, but have continued to fund the settlement program, continued to fund Israel's war machine, and treat it kind of like a spoilt child, along with Saudi Arabia, its twin. And that's why Israel has no incentive to compromise or come to a resolution with the Palestinians.
What do you make of Trump and his first few months in office?
Well, I don't have a lot of respect for Donald Trump as an individual, given his track record in terms of casinos, in terms of his business dealings, and his rather authoritarian approach to decision-making. How long he survives as a president is debatable. But at the end of the day, I mean, we can say good and bad things about President Putin in Russia, Donald Trump, even Theresa May. What matters is on what basis decisions are made. Are they based on the rule of international law, or on the basis of power brokers and individuals who wield great influence, whether it's through their money or through their armies? The world has suffered a great deal from dictators and the like. And, I and colleagues are calling for the implementation of international law and the recognition of the role of the United Nations in resolving conflicts such as that between Israel and Palestine.
When he was campaigning, Trump said he wanted to see the capital of Israel shifted from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Now he seems to have reined back on that.
He's not the first, and that's because the reality is the Zionist lobby wants to create Jerusalem as its capital, and the various sessions of Congress have passed the legislation to do that. They have identified the location, the funding is there, but every president since 1967 has refused to sign off on the legislation. And so what Donald Trump might have said when he was electioneering is very different from what he's willing to do now as president. He's clearly taking advice from his State Department, who are advising him strongly against recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel because of the impact it will have militarily in the Middle East, as well as on the US's standing in the Middle East too.
The whole idea of moving the capital to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv is one of your points on your roadmap to Armageddon, that you've pointed out that there are various things which the Israeli state has wanted over the years, some of which they've got, some of which they still want. Can you just run us through that point by point? You know, what is it that is this? I mean, it sounds like an awful way to end up Armageddon, but it does seem that if you've got religious fundamentalists that believe this war is inevitable, then they believe that there probably will be these steps on the way to get there.
Well, if you think in terms of three concentric rings, the outside one is the land, and if you go back 100 years, the Balfour Declaration, the promise made by the British government to the Zionist movement was that we would allow a Jewish presence in the British Empire. We would not create a state, but we'd give them a homeland. Because if you remember, in 1917, Britain was the world superpower, and we weren't giving anyone anything for free. We were blessing them with membership of the British Empire. And that's, I think, what Balfour understood he was promising the Jews. They saw it very differently. They thought that Israel was going to bequeath to them both sides of the River Jordan and reconstitute, if you like, the borders of the kingdom of David and Solomon. That wasn't going to be, because we'd already agreed with the French we were going to split Syria and Lebanon off and give that to the French, and Britain was going to keep what became Israel, Palestine, Jordan and Iraq within our empires. But as our empire waned, and as we got beaten up and shot at by both sides, Arabs and Jews, when they realized we weren't going to give them what we'd promised them, we got out and left it to them to fight over in the War of 1948. But if the outside ring is the land, the second ring is Jerusalem, and the third ring is the temple. Israel is largely a secular state, but within Israel and also within the wider Jewish community, alongside the Christian Zionist community, is a strong religious conviction that the temple must be rebuilt. So you have these three concentric circles, the land, Jerusalem, and the temple. So Jerusalem itself might be the goal of the secular Zionists, but the temple is the key for those who have religious convictions. So the existence of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock sitting on the Haram al-Sharif, or the Temple Mount, is regarded as anathema, an abomination to both Zionists and Christian Zionists. There have been various attempts to destroy it, and others pray daily that the temple will be rebuilt. Only then will Israel, as a religious as well as political state, be complete. But how they get there, if they get there, and the consequences are really terrifying when you consider the nuclear, chemical and biological weapons that exist in an area that is about the size of Wales.
Is it possible for Judaism and Jewish temple and Islam to coexist on that site?
Well, you have to ask the Jews and the Muslims. From a Christian perspective, land is not that important. And although we have some very fine Christian buildings, we worship at an empty tomb. We don't regard any bit of real estate as sacred or holy or to be fought over or died for. So from a Christian perspective, there is no need for a temple. It's a retrograde step from a Christian perspective because we have a temple, that's Jesus. We have a high priest, that's Jesus. But they share it now. The Western Wall is the place where Jews pray, and the Haram al-Sharif is where the Muslims pray. So they pray right next to each other on a daily basis. So coexistence is possible, but if the expectation is that the Dome of the Rock's got to be destroyed and a temple built next to it, you're asking for the impossible, and it will ignite a conflict between Muslims worldwide. It is the third holiest shrine within Islam. And we're not just talking about the Arabs in the Middle East, the Muslims in the Middle East. We're talking about Muslims in Southeast Asia, Britain, America, and virtually every country. So it would be a provocative act. Now, attempts are made every year to do that. There is a group called the Temple Mount Faithful, who in July, on the day when they remember the destruction of the temple, attempt to relay the cornerstones for the new temple, and the police who control the Temple Mount refuse them access. So attempts are being made all the time to take that territory. They could have done it in 1967, ironically, but at that time they chose not to.
Now, you have had a few scrapes with the Church of England, despite being a vicar. Could you explain what your position is now? Because they told you, I think, not that you weren't allowed to use social media. And it must be very difficult for a vicar who's told he's not allowed to talk about the Middle East.
Well, I haven't really talked about this publicly, but if I could just correct you on that. Anglican clergy are free to express opinions on any subject, and unless one commits a criminal act, one is not restricted in how one interprets one's ministry. So the reality is I voluntarily agreed to give up using social media for a short period of time to help diffuse a situation where quite a powerful lobby in the UK was targeting me, along with other Anglican clergy and others, and putting pressure on the church to discipline me and others. The reality was I voluntarily agreed to give up using social media at the request of my bishop for a period of time, and I'm now free as an Anglican clergyman to continue to do so.
So if people want to buy your books, obviously, those are available. Maybe you could just remind us of the titles or follow your work. Are you blogging, and how would they do that?
Well, if you type my name, Stephen Sizer, you'll find me on the internet. My website is stephensizer.com. I'm now director of a Christian charity called Peacemaker Mediators, and the website is peacemakers.ngo. We're committed to peacemaking, and our focus is wherever minorities are persecuted, where justice is denied, where human rights are suppressed, reconciliation is needed. So we're a Christian charity, registered charity, and I'm working in a number of countries, particularly in the Middle East, where Christians are having a hard time. And that's the focus of my ministry now. But folk listening are very welcome to check out my website and find details of my books. Most of what I've said and written is freely available online at no cost.
Just remind us of the titles of the books again, Stephen.
Christian Zionism Roadmap to Armageddon is published by IVP, and that was a look at the historical roots, theological basis and political consequences of Christian Zionism, which is the dominant form of Zionism in the world. And the second book was called Zion's Christian Soldiers, the Bible, Israel and the Church, and that looks in more detail at how the Bible has been abused, misused, misquoted, and attempts to explain in simple terms how the Bible should be read, and as a consequence of that, diffuse the situation in Israel-Palestine today.
That's the retired Reverend Stephen Sizer. Now, Martin, he was ticked off early last year for posting a Facebook link to an article saying 9/11, Israel did it, all the proof in the world.
Yes, he was. And, of course, 9/11 is the big elephant in the room. We were talking about the fire in Kensington earlier. And, of course, one thing that didn't happen is the building didn't collapse. And there's been loads of fires in similar buildings all over the world since 9/11, and none of them have collapsed. On 9/11, 3 tall buildings collapsed, supposedly through fire. But, of course, if it was a fire that brought down the 3 buildings, you'd have thought people have changed the fire regulations all over the world, that have closed down loads of high-rise buildings, etc. But, of course, in actual fact, the buildings were bombed, as Donald Trump pointed out on the day, and as Niels Harrit and Steve Jones of the University of Utah and the University of Copenhagen have shown in scientific papers that they've had reviewed by peers. And, it's pretty clear the buildings were bombed.
people have been pointing out, Martin, flames are engulfing the Grenfell Tower for nearly 24 hours, whereas when flames engulfed the very top sections of the New York's high-rise tower, the Twin Towers, it was only an hour and 42 minutes before they collapsed.
Apart from WTC7, the third building, which collapsed at 5:30 some hours later, but if you look at the video of it, it doesn't seem to be on fire at all. All three buildings were bombed. That's pretty clear. The Russian General Staff now know that. General Ivashov was the commander of the Russian General Staff on the day. People can look his stuff up.
Also, Emmanuel Macron's party remains on course for a historic landslide win, and it's a brand new party out of nowhere.
Yeah, with a very, very low turnout, I think you'll see. There was a big turnout in the presidential elections, and lots of people have just stayed home. We'll have to see how he rules. Also,
Jeff Sessions this week, Donald Trump's Attorney General, was grilled over his links to Russia, and he has said... he's actually saying that this attack is appalling and detestable lies, false and scurrilous attacks against him. Some people are even saying that this is a little bit like a kind of McCarthyite witch hunt, kind of Arthur Miller and this sort of witch hunt. Well, I think it is, but what's really bizarre about it, it's the liberal press in the US which is trying to run a Russian mole hunt. And of course it was the liberals like Arthur Miller who resisted this kind of thing back in the 50s. So also, a bit of a change of pace there. Also a shooting in Virginia, congressman being shot at hardly injured, but the shooter is killed. Yeah, well, the shooter was supposedly a Bernie Sanders nutcase supporter. Bernie Sanders has already sort of said he condemns it. There may be a strategy of tension going on here, where various nutters go around blowing things up and shooting people from both sides of the political spectrum. And what's the point? Keep everybody on edge, and more power to the deep state. Time to sign off now for the Murdoch News at 7, coming up live on Facebook, and Arabian Nights with Mohammed Makawi and Yusuf, the Ramadan edition. Thanks to our guest in the first hour, leader of the Conservative Group on Bristol City Council, Councillor for Henbury and Brentry, that's Mark Weston, also Labour Councillor for Eastville, Vari Threlfall, and also, of course, you just heard there, old Labour Oxford economist Martin Summers, and Stephen Sizer, the long interview just now. Our sister show Dialects here on BCFM at noon every Tuesday. This show's story links and comment pages. One word, thisweek.org.uk. You'll find me on Twitter at Tony Gosling. Here's wishing you a relaxing and enjoyable BCFM weekend. Do please join us on the Politics Show at the same time next week. God bless, and don't let the banksters get you down.
This is Bristol's BCFM on 93.2, online and on your mobile. BCFM is an award-winning community radio station for Bristol, bringing you national news on the hour. Live from the Sky News Centre.